The following podcast is offered freely through the Insight Meditation Community of Washington and by Jonathan Foust. To learn more or to make a donation to support this work, please go to www.jonathanfoust.com. I've been talking recently about the heart practices, some of the different trainings that help us to cultivate compassion, kindness, joy, and equanimity. And tonight's talk is on self-compassion, the practice of offering kindness towards self. Next week we'll talk about compassion for others, but they kind of bleed together. So I wanted to start by sharing one of my favorite stories, which I have lifted from Tony Robbins. It's one of his classic stories. He was giving a seminar on success, what it means to be successful, as he does. And he asked people in a room to raise their hand if they felt they were successful. So some people raised their hand and some people didn't. So he wanted to interview some of the people in the group. So he went over to this one fellow who didn't raise his hand. And he said, "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" I said, No, go ahead. He said, "How much money did you make last year?" This guy said, "About $850,000. He said, "Do you work out?" He said, "Yeah, I run 4 or 5 marathons a year." I said, "Do you have kids?" He goes, "Yeah, I've got a son and a daughter, and they're both in Ivy League schools." So he said, "You didn't raise your hand. Why?" He said, "Well, I made $850,000, but I play golf with these guys who've made a lot more money than that. And I run marathons, but my body fat is still 0.2% off my goal, and I cannot get it lower. And my son and daughter are in college, but one of them is majoring in English, the other one in history, and I think they're wasting their time." So he thanked them. And he went over, and there was someone who did raise their hand. And he said, "Do you mind if I ask you a few questions?" I said, "No, I'm fine with that." He said, "How much money did you make last year?" He said, "About $34,000. I drive a bus." He said, "Do you have kids?" He goes, Yeah, I've got 2 kids. They're, both working." He said, "But you raised your hand that you were a success." The guy said, "Yeah, absolutely." And he said, "Why?" And he said, "Look, buddy, where I come from, every day above ground is a good day." I love that statement because it's a very important thing to remember. And when we really look at the miracle of being alive, we tend to forget that it's a miracle. Given that we have this blessing of being alive in a body, how is it that we're so miserable? Or we're such a knot of complaints? We lose a sense of compassion for ourselves and for others. It's a natural part of living in a human body. So what I'd like to touch on tonight, just in the little bit of time we have here, is first to talk a little bit about how it is that we lose a sense of compassion for ourselves. And what is the cause? Well, what's the cause of feeling that severing from any sense of compassion for self? And talk a little bit about how you can cultivate compassion, and then a little bit about this path of the heart, this cultivation of the heart, and what that means. So losing our connection to compassion is quite interesting. You may have heard about this study where white, middle-aged, high school educated or less whites are dying at kind of an unprecedented rate. While many other populations, the mortality rate is dropping, but it's actually going up for this particular population. And the cause of death is drugs, alcohol, and suicide. As this report said, there are 500,000 people who are dead who should not be dead in this country. And that's 40 times the Ebola statistics. And it's closing in on HIV/AIDS in terms of just a statistical anomaly in our culture. So one of the people doing the study said, I think it has something to do with the pain underlying these lives, both physical and psychic. And that is the age when people have their midlife crisis. And I think it has to do with the stage of life. And ailments start to accumulate at this age. And while this is about one specific population, I think we can all relate to the fact that we have a story about ourselves, about what our life should be, and what's possible. And sometimes that doesn't happen. The story we have doesn't match reality. And then it becomes, what do we do when we're up against that reality? As the saying goes, if you argue with reality, you're going to lose. So we all come against that experience of deep disappointment, of feeling betrayed by life, of just the dread, the overwhelm that comes with life in a human body. And it's helpful to reflect on the four cornerstones of Buddhist philosophy. These are the insights from the Buddha's awakening, and the depth of his practice was first realizing that there is a fact of suffering. Sometimes that's mistranslated. Some people translate it as life is suffering, but that's not the translation. That suffering happens in life. It's a fact. It just comes with human form. That there is a cause of suffering. The third is the cessation of suffering. It's actually possible to release ourselves from suffering. And that there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. So suffering happens to all of us. And what we naturally want to do is to find relief from that suffering. And one strategy is to find relief in drugs and alcohol. Not a good long-term solution. So the question becomes then, how do we come into reality? How do we recognize what is real and find a way to grow from it? And that's what this practice is all about. It's about seeing clearly. The word vipassana means to see clearly. So to see clearly what is here requires a certain rigor, a tremendous amount of courage. And the curious thing about it is that when you see clearly, when you see truth, it is an automatic doorway to compassion. But we have to recognize that truth first. And oftentimes the truth is really getting just how deep that suffering is, rather than trying to sidestep it. So suffering happens to all of us. We're all destined to die in no particular order. Which leads to the question of what is the cause for this suffering? What is the cause for feeling cut off from self-compassion? A number of years ago, I had a training through Spirit Rock in California. It was a training in the Dharma, 2.5-year training. And we were doing some work with diversity. And we were sitting around in small groups, and we were asked to name a time when we realized we were different, or we felt separate. And there was a woman in my training, a lovely woman from Trinidad, I believe. She's an older woman. I'll call her Sophie just for this little story. And she was this wonderful blend of sort of Asian, African American, just a beautiful woman. And she told this story about, in her family, she had this one older cousin that she adored. She was much older than her and just loved being around her, really her ideal. And she heard one day when I think her cousin was in another room and she was sort of listening around the corner. She was maybe like a 6 or 7. And her cousin was talking about boys and dating and all that sort of thing. And she said, "I'm so glad I'm light-skinned. I would hate to be like Sophie." And suddenly, for her, it was a recognition of what? There's something different with me. There's something wrong about me. And that was a severing experience for her. That cut deep. And while that experience was profound for her, we have all had that experience of getting a message that we're not good enough or that we're different. Either we're not smart enough, we're not fast enough, we're not good looking enough, whatever it may be, there's some sense of falling short. And it's an interesting thing to reflect on that. And so maybe we'll do just a short little meditation. When you close your eyes and let your breath deepen. And when you reflect on this first sense that there was something wrong with you or that you were falling short in some way, how far back can you trace the earliest memories of that? Where you found yourself comparing yourself or some message of falling short. And you might just take a moment and just sense what it's like to internalize that message, to whatever degree you may have internalized that. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. I would imagine for many of us that memory goes back to a pretty young age. Anyone not get that message at some point? I'd like to talk to you afterward if not. What often happens when we receive that message that we don't belong or we're not enough, it sets up some chronic sense of grasping or some chronic sense of aversion, a sense that we're not quite enough. I realized many, many years later when my parents had passed, that they had saved a number of our letters that we wrote home. And I was appalled when I looked at the letters that I wrote home from, prep school and college and being overseas, that how much my letters were really just my completed to-do lists. And so much of what I was trying to do was to show how much I was getting done. But I was never satisfied about that. Always this sense of chronically reaching. And I think many of us, if you take a look at your to-do list, it's usually beyond what is reasonable. So the question becomes, when are we enough? When do we actually have a sense of being enough? And it's interesting how some people, not all people, when they get the message that they have a terminal illness, some people relax. It's like suddenly I don't have to worry about the house payment. I don't have to worry about taking care of everyone. There's actually a sense of relief that occurs. And that core belief, whatever it may be, the sense of not being enough, it's universal. And under that is what's called, in both Buddhism and through yoga philosophy, a klesha. And a klesha, one translation for the word klesha is an affliction. These are the mental states that cause torment. Sometimes they're called poisons, and they are attachment, aversion, ignorance, pride, and jealousy. And the klesha here is ignorance, because the very first klesha we experience is believing that we're separate, believing that we're separate from Source. And what can naturally happen is we believe that we're separate, we believe that we're different, then we start building a story about that. We develop our aversions and our attractions. We build up this narrative of who we are, and the final part of that is a terror of death, because you've invested everything into the story of who you are, and it's all going away. What mindfulness does, what meditation can do, is it brings you back to the here and now. It's a re-arriving. It's a remembering who you are. And while so much of meditation is about, as I like to say, feeling better, feeling your depression better, feeling your anger better, feeling your sadness better, it's also about feeling who you really are. It's about those perhaps just moments or glimpses that we have in meditation. That when ignorance is not happening, that is to say, when you're clearly present to what is here, when aversion is not happening, when clinging is not happening, when there's a contentment of what is here, you have a glimpse of what we could say is your true nature. In the absence of those afflictions, there is this amazing moment, kind of the mystery. So the question becomes, how do we find ourselves back in connection with the mystery, having access to compassion? There are a number of venues. One is this essential practice of meditation, which you can see as kind of a switch. Either you are identified with your story, or you are in the raw, immediate experience of here and now. That's very much what meditation is. You're wondering about what you're going to do tomorrow morning, and then you realize you're having a thought. You come back to the breath, you feel the breath, and you have these moments of simply arriving, simply being present. Those are healing moments. Another venue, another portal, is through cultivating gratitude and appreciation. When you cultivate a sense of gratitude and appreciation, there is an arriving. There's a yes to what is here. As Werner Erhard said, the quickest way to be happy is to choose what you already have. And so that becomes a very powerful strategy to cultivate gratitude for what is here. So part of opening to self-compassion requires that you become very aware of what's between you and self-compassion. You don't necessarily even have to look for it. It will find you if you pay attention. So a friend had told me how he was very troubled all through his life in relationship with his father. A sense of never-ending criticism. His father was always pointing out his flaws. If he did something well, his father would point out the one or two things he could have done a little bit better. And he never had a sense that he ever met his father's expectations. He just sensed he was a chronic sense of disappointment. But his entire life was about trying to make up for that. He really made pleasing his father the center point of his life. He went into a career that he didn't really enjoy because he could make money. Every time he would break away from his father, it always had something to do about proving himself to his father. And he told me the story. And he had just bought a McMansion. And he pulled up to his new McMansion in his really nice sports car. And as he pulled up into the driveway, he had a very clear thought. He thought to himself, maybe this is going to show the old man who I really am. And right after that, he remembered that his father had been dead for 5 years. So much of our life is driven by our narrative. Each one of us, I think, at some point in our life asks ourselves, whose life am I living? Am I living out the life that my primary caretakers implanted in me as what I should do? It becomes a very powerful process of waking up to what your path is, what your dharma is. But just seeing that thought really wasn't enough for my friend. It was very helpful to see just how much of his life was living in reaction to the fear of shame, the fear of failure, etc., etc. But he realized later what he really needed to do was to look very closely at that seed of aversion that he had felt. It was one thing to get it intellectually, but it was very important for him to see just how much that hurt, just how much that lack of compassion from his father hurt, and just how much his entire life was living out of reaction to that. So his practice was to bring compassion for himself. For all those years of strain and focus and doing what he didn't want to do, he had a tremendous sense of self-aversion, a whole story of how he missed his life because of that. So what he had to do was to slow down, and when the memories would arise, to really investigate them. I speak all the time of the acronym of RAIN. The R is to recognize or realize what is present. And for him, at times, as he sort of rode those waves, was recognizing, oh, here's the story of how I gave my power away and I wasted my life. The A is to allow or accept that. And it takes tremendous courage to say, okay, let me really just be with that. The I is to investigate and to really be intimate with it. And for him, it was really a sense of grieving, a sense of rage, all kinds of emotions that he was able to access by simply being with it intimately. And what he started to get to eventually was a sense of compassion. As Thich Nhat Hanh says, when you contact some form of pain, you simply say to yourself, I care about this suffering. It is a dramatic and radical act to simply pause and say, I care about this suffering. And when he began to do that, he began to soften. He began to sense how he was always doing his best. On some level, how much he cared for his father. And he began to sense underneath all of that what an authentic life meant for him. And on some level he felt he started to get his life back through that practice of really pausing and offering compassion for his particular suffering. As we go through life, we are constantly beset by the 8 worldly winds. When these 8 worldly winds are not present, there can be a tremendous sense of joy, a tremendous sense of being and presence. but they consist of 4 aversions, 4 things that we are terrified of, and 4 things we crave, 4 things we seek. Every one of us has a fear of blame, a fear of loss, a fear of shame, and a fear of despair. And every one of us has an intense craving for the opposite, which is to be praised, to be a winner, to gain, to be famous, and to be happy. That feeling of not good enough can invoke a very, very deep aversion to shame and fear and blame and loss. And as I've shared before, some of the most successful people I've met on the planet, their entire life has been about avoiding those 4 experiences. The fear of loss and shame and blame is terrifying. As we begin to unwind all the narratives we have around not being enough and the fear of not being enough and our intense desire for success and happiness, it can feel quite disorienting. I know quite a few people, as their mindfulness practice deepens, things start changing dramatically. The old strategies aren't quite working the way they were. Old friends just quite aren't as comfortable as they were before. There's a sense of something possible, but they don't know quite what it is. And really what this is a practice of transformation, where the old identity begins to fall apart. Something naturally begins to emerge. And so it becomes a very important time in practice to continually assess what is most supportive. Are there new allies that you can have in your life that want what you want? Can you build more resilience and resolve in your life as you feel the old life falling away and sensing something new beginning to emerge? When I've explored self-compassion as a practice with people, many people find a real fear that if they let that harsh inner critic, if they let that harsh judging voice soften a little bit, that they would get complacent. If I'm not pushing myself, I'm just going to become a vegetable. And there may be something to that. We have a way of driving ourselves through criticism and judgment. But I think it's worth the experiment to explore what it's like to offer self-compassion as opposed to self-judgment. I was raised a Quaker, and as I have shared before, I grew up with a lot of really angry pacifists around me. And I've noticed that angry pacifists have a certain degree of effectiveness in the world, and compassionate activists have a different degree of effectiveness in the world. When we look at Mahatma Gandhi and Luther King and Nelson Mandela, it's quite amazing to see what they have accomplished through their own practice of compassion for self and compassion for others. And what if we did that for ourselves? So just another story of someone I spent some time with. It was someone who was ruthlessly critical toward herself, as well as everyone around her. She never let herself off the hook. She never let her kids or her family off the hook. And as you can imagine, part of the reason why I was talking to her was because she was miserable. She was alienated from her family. She didn't have friends. And she was judging herself for being so judgmental. Maybe you know that. Ever been there? It's like you know you're being judgmental and you hate yourself for being judgmental. So I asked her if she wanted to look a little closer at that pattern. Of course, that's what she was there for, so she said yes. And we began to explore that sense of judging and judging others, of how far back that went. And pretty quickly she was aware she had a very critical, withholding mother. And the more she kind of hung out with that, she got what that felt like. She was pretty familiar with the dynamic. But then she began to reflect a little bit on her mother's life, of what her mother's life was, to do a role reversal with her mother. And she knew her grandmother, and she pretty quickly made the connection that her grandmother was also a ruthlessly cold and judging person. And that began to melt her heart a little bit toward her mother, realizing that her mother really had this affliction. And so we began to explore, just to surmise, how far back that familiar pattern of judging, withholding parents, how far back that went. And of course, who knows how far back it went. But as she was sensing this pattern and her inheritance of that pattern, it became a radical question to ask, what if this is not your fault? What if it wasn't her mother's fault? When we begin to really look at the patterns we live in, and we know intellectually that everyone would do a better job if they could, but particularly when we look at ourselves, what if it's not your fault? That's not a way of unhooking from responsibility. But as Buddhist philosophy says, there are two things. You are the inheritor of your karma. All actions are part of your inheritance. The family structure, the personalities in your family, your culture, all of that have shaped who you are. The second part of that equation is you are the creator of your karma. That you do not have to be destined to simply live out the patterns of your inheritance. That it can stop with you. And that was a powerful moment in conversation with this woman. When she got how far back this pattern of judgment went, she paused and she said with tears in her eyes, "This stops with me. I am not handing this on to my kids." The only way we can begin to access healing is through compassion. We speak of two wings of the practice. We're cultivating wisdom, clear seeing, and we're cultivating compassion, the capacity to be with. And they have to work together. You can't just go into free-flowing compassion without really knowing what it's addressing. And compassion doesn't begin to flow until you can really pause and get the deep ouch, the deep wounding that may be part of your experience. So perhaps we can do just a short little meditation, just a little reflection on this. You might just take a moment to contact your breath. And you might, as you breathe, just take a moment to reflect on something in your life that's between you and feeling free. Just something going on that's between you and feeling really good inside. It might be something in a relationship or some anxiety or worry that you might have. And just take a moment to just select one particular issue. We can just take a minute or two with this. And when you have it in mind, you might sense if you can find a visual image that represents it, either a moving image or a still image. Just recognizing what this is like. Just sense, can I allow it? Can I be with it? And if so, just turn your attention to what it feels like on the inside as you think about this particular issue. Is there a particular emotion that you can name that might resonate or describe what this feels like inside? And if not, you might just sort of be with this felt sense of it. And part of the R, or the recognizing in this practice, is simply to let it know you see it. Just to say, I see you. And you might, if you like, just as an option, you might bring your hand to your heart and just offer these words from Thich Nhat Hanh. I care about the suffering. And just a sense, if you were to offer this some form of compassion or empathy or kindness, and just track however it might move or shift or change. Seeing clearly and offering a sense of care or compassion, and noticing how this can be a lubricant. It allows it to flow, allows it to shift in some way. And if you like, you can let the eyes open in your own time. There are lots of skillful means, lots of trainings in awareness to learn how to concentrate, to learn how to witness, to learn how to see clearly. And then there are many different trainings that are about opening the heart, about softening the heart to what is here. With all the recent turmoil in the world, not just in Paris, but in Kenya and Beirut and other places, it's hard not to feel horrified. And the question becomes, how can we hold this? And I really see how our culture is very much like an individual human brain, that we all have the capacity to access that reptilian brain that simply creates the enemy and wants to eliminate the enemy. But there's also the compassion that I'm sure we have all felt to some degree of just seeing the suffering that these acts of terrorism have created in the world. And the question that was asked to the Buddha, and certainly many wise beings, is it possible to be in a world with so much turmoil and to keep our hearts open and to actually cultivate happiness? And from what I sense, the answer is yes, it is possible. And in fact, it's our responsibility to cultivate compassion and happiness. I forget who the comic was that said, try and be happy. It will drive your enemies crazy. But nonetheless, we do have that capacity to see clearly and to hold our hearts open. Let's close again with just a short meditation and a little reflection. And we'll explore the sense of internal compassion and compassion for others. You might just take a moment, just in these breaths, just to, again, allow yourself to arrive. And if just for a moment, as you sense these kleshas, these mental afflictions of greed, of hatred, of ignorance, of pride and jealousy, you might just take a moment to sense who you are in the absence of these. Just this moment, and this breath. You might bring into mind one person in your life that might be struggling right now. And in your own way, just to let them know that you see them. And in your own way to offer those words or just that felt sense, I care about this suffering. And you might allow that sense of compassion to spread to all beings in all directions. And you might imagine, just in these final moments, that you could somehow magically hook your awareness up to some inexhaustible source of compassion. And imagine that just flooding into your body and flowing out to all beings. And as we explore the limitless quality of compassion and joy and kindness, we'll just close with these two lines from the short poem. Even after all these years, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens. With a love like that, it lights up the whole sky. And when you're ready, you can deepen your breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Well, thank you for your kind and compassionate listening. Just a few quick announcements. Just a reminder that we do have yoga at 6:30. If you'd like to come early, bring your mat, a blanket, and that's from 6:30 to 7:20. If you'd like to be on the mailing list, you can sign up in the back. And thank you as always for your support for the church and me and IMCW. And as one way to explore self-compassion, you might consider giving yourself a cookie. They will be waiting for you. Enjoy your evening. Thank you.